Well, this is a prompt crowd. This is what happens on Saturday afternoon, huh? Everybody gets huge kudos for being here on Saturday afternoon. But of course, the reason why you're here are the two people to my left, which is you've chosen well. So my name is Bill Madison. I teach here in the Department of Theology and also for the Alliance for Catholic Education, or ACE program. And it's a real privilege to be here with all of you today. And obviously just a phenomenal event. So welcome, and we're very glad you're here. So it's my task to convene the session, introduce our speakers. I'll introduce both Professor Camosi and Professor McKenney at the outset. Charlie will speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and Jerry will then respond for about 7 or 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So that's the game plan, okay? So Charlie Camosi is an Associate Professor of Theology at Fordham University. He's a native of Wisconsin and a double domer. He received his PhD in theology from Notre Dame in 2008. He's the award-winning author of several books, most recently Losing Our Dignity, How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality. He's got books from Cambridge, Erdman's, I think we're on book 6, single author. His numerous academic articles have appeared in Journal of Moral Theology, Horizons, the American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, and the Journal of the Catholic Health Association. He's published essays in places like USA Today, the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Washington Post, Newark Star Ledger, America, and Commonweal. So Charlie, we'll have you come up in a moment, but first let me just introduce Jerry. So Jerry McKenney is the Walter Professor of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. He teaches and writes on Christian ethics and the ethics of biotechnology. He's the author of To Relieve the Human Condition, The Analogy of Grace, Karl Barth's Moral Theology, and Biotechnology, Human Nature, and Christian Ethics, along with about 50 articles and book chapters on Christian ethics, biomedical ethics, the ethics of biotechnology, religious ethics, and the philosophy of medicine. He's the co-editor of 4 other books, including The Ethical Altering Nature and Darwin in the 21st Century. And he recently published Karl Barth's Moral Thought with Oxford University Press, and has begun work on a 1-volume Christian ethics based on the gospel story of the rich young man. So without further ado, Charlie Camosi.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be back home at Notre Dame, and great to be back in something that resembles McKenna Hall, I guess. For those of you that may remember the old version, this is nothing like the old version. We may have to ask some ship of Thesis questions about whether this, in fact, is still McKenna Hall after all of this. Anyway, it's great to be introduced by Bill. Bill was here studying moral theology a few years before I was, and is someone I've looked up to ever since. And it's even better, can I say that, to be with Jerry, who is was a very important mentor of mine here, and still is very much. My talk this afternoon is taken from the book that Bill mentioned that just came out this summer. And maybe a good place to start is my thesis for the book. Our secularized and even irreligious culture, especially in medicine and other institutions with incredible power, particularly over life and death, no longer have the resources to explain why all human beings are equal. Once we abandon the theological idea that all members of the human family are equal because they share a common nature, which bears the image and likeness of God, there is nothing left but actualized concepts like autonomy, rationality, self-awareness, will, productivity, blah, 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 blah. You've heard them all. Human beings quite clearly do not have these capacities in equal measure. Some appear not to have them at all. And more human populations are falling out of the circle of protection that fundamental human equality provides. It is time to sound the alarm about where this is going. And if you know anything about me, you know I'm not an alarmist. In fact, I try to boil down the alarm, draw down the alarm, especially in a polarized culture like ours. But I think here in particular, it's time to sound the alarm. And hopefully you'll see why over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. Let me begin with a gravestone. It may seem like a strange place to start, but if any of you and my students don't know who Terri Schiavo is, which is really humbly about how old I've become. I not only can't use Seinfeld references in class, I can't even talk about Terry Schiavo anymore. But many of you in this room will know the case. She was said to be in a so-called vegetative state, and had her food and water withdrawn after a lengthy fight that roiled the nation, involved the Supreme Court, Congress, so many other levels of our public discourse. Her husband, Michael Schiavo, is responsible for the text you see in front of you on the gravestone. He said she departed this earth February 25th, 1990. That was the date of her catastrophic brain injury, and was at peace March 31st, 2005, which was a few days after she was denied food and water, essentially. Now, how anyone can talk about departing this earth in light of the video I'm about to show you is maybe at the heart of what I'm arguing in this book. And I just want to play maybe a minute of this video. This is from 2002, Terry Schiavo, Listening to Music. This is clearly a living human being, a fellow member of our human family. What could it possibly mean to say that she had departed this earth back in 1990, if that's her in 2002? Clearly, something like a Manichaean dualism is at place here, where, at least from Michael's perspective, her living human body is different from her essence in some way, that she could have departed this earth back in 1990. Now, if this sounds very strange to you, and I think it should sound very strange to us, I think the groundwork for this was actually laid decades before, and it was laid, I was told I need to click here and move there. It was laid at Harvard Medical School, the foundation was for this point of view. This is Dr. Robert Ebert, almost said Roger, who was dean of Harvard Medical School from 65 to 77. Dean Ebert had a problem soon after he came, and the name of that problem was Henry K. Beecher, who is a famed anesthesiologist and chairman of Harvard Medical School's IRB. He kept pushing, Beecher did, Ebert to change the definition of death. He said, quote, "Every major hospital has patients stacked up waiting for suitable donors." And he succeeded in petitioning Ebert to establish what would become, at least in my world, the famous or infamous 1968 ad hoc committee of the Harvard Medical School to examine the definition of brain death. And he also succeeded in getting the outcome he wanted, but only after a failed first draft of the committee's report. And the first draft, I think, is extremely, extremely revealing. In fact, after Ebert got Beecher's first draft, he returned it and said, quote, "It suggests you wish to define death in order to make viable organs more readily available to persons requiring transplants." This is about the time we had just started with the ability to do transplants of vital organs. And not long before that, we had invented ventilators, which made people who had catastrophic brain injuries be able to survive them. And Beecher was interested in defining death explicitly so we could have more organs to take and preserve the dead donor rule. But despite its clear origins as a way of maximizing resources, and this is a key point, resources are at the heart of the denial of human equality in each of the cases I'll imagine here and talk to you here about. This view of the human person, as you may know, has become the law in all 50 states, with only New York and New Jersey allowing for religious freedom exemptions. Though those exemptions would become very, very important in the next case I want to talk to you about, which is that of Jahi McMath. Jahi McMath was a very young woman who had tragically another catastrophic brain injury, but she was in California at the time. And the only reason she was even able to be treated is because they were able to her family was able to take her to New Jersey, where they actually allowed religious freedom exemption that she and her family were able to take advantage of. And I just want to play a very short clip of some of the news coverage of Terri Schiavo, which also gives you a more, I think, for lack of a better way of saying it, richer or thicker understanding of what's happening here with this case as well.
Months after several neurologists declared her brain dead, a Bay Area family wants that ruling reversed.
KPIX5's Linda Yee shows us the video that Jahai McMath's family says is proof that she is alive. Linda?
Well, Ken, the video clips do show movement, but are they what some neurologists say are spontaneous reflexes common in brain-dead patients, or is it truly a miracle?
Come on, Jahai, we're watching. Come on, girl, you did that very good. Oh, so proud of you, boo.
She moved her foot on command, says Jahai's mother, and as the days passed, there was more.
Very good. Very good, Jahai.
Nyla Winkfield has been by her daughter's bedside for the past 9 months.
So then I said, okay, well, move your thumb if you can hear me. And then she moves her thumb again. So I said, okay. So she knows the difference between left and right. She knows her fingers. If I say move your leg, that's something that she can do with no issues.
The family's attorney showed brain scans and EEG results to bolster their argument. The neurosurgeons at Oakland's Children's Hospital were wrong when they said Jahai was brain dead. And a panel of whom they describe as experts.
Let us stop it there in the interest of time. So she appears to have movement, response commands, even knows left from right. And we already know, and it's undisputed, that so-called brain-dead human beings can fight off infections, respond to and heal bodily trauma, reach puberty. Jahai, in fact, California had declared Jahai dead, and then she got her first period after being declared dead. So they could reach puberty and even successfully gestate prenatal children to birth. But think about, if you know anything about the case, you know a little bit about this. I want you to think about how Jahai McMath's medical team handled the situation in California. There. This is David Durand, who is PEDS chief at UC San Francisco. He was the boss of the medical team that was treating Jahai. He said, this is taken from my book, "What is it that you don't understand?" Dr. Durand condescendingly asked them. Then, according to Jahai's mother, stepfather, grandmother, brother, and their lawyer who took notes, Durand pounded his fist on the table saying, "She's dead, dead, dead." What is going on here? Well, I think one person that's diagnosed what's going on here extremely well is Peter Singer. He rightly sees this shift as totally transformative for medicine, bioethics, and culture. And he also agrees it's absurd to claim that human organisms who fight off infections, gestate children, enter puberty, react to bodily trauma with increased heart rate, release adrenaline, are in any sense biologically or medically dead. What in fact has happened, according to Singer, with broad acceptance of the Harvard Brain Death Commission, is what the subtitle of his famous book, Rethinking Life and Death, suggests. It's the collapse of our traditional ethics. There has been a Copernican revolution against fundamental human equality, and the idea that human beings bearing a common nature that reflects the image and likeness of God has been abandoned in favor of an ethic which locates moral value in something other than bearing a common human nature. Interesting to note that Singer himself in practical ethics cannot come up with any basis for equality at all among persons, except maybe reaction to preferences or something like that. It's a little complicated, but certainly nothing like what we would understand as fundamental human equality. But a funny thing happened on the way to consensus, which may shake this up a little bit. Peter Singer, I think, is not alone, especially over the last maybe 10 years or so, maybe 15 years, and calling into question some of these things. But even with Jahai McMath now, the Journal of Neurological Sciences had an article not too long ago, actually, I think back in May, where it basically argued that Jahai, it turns out, was not brain dead, even by the standards that are typically used. And they, in fact, describe her as having something, which I think is fair to call a neologism, responsive unawake syndrome. Responsive unawake syndrome. So we're even questioning a context in which the head of PEDS is slamming his fist on the table saying she's dead, dead, dead. Oops, she had responsive unawake syndrome. Back to PVS, or so-called persistent vegetative state. Do you know the work of Joe Finis? If you don't, I really recommend this book, Rights Come to Mind. I don't think we fully processed the implications of what Finis found in this magisterial 2015 text. In fact, if you hear the term PVS stated without some kind of reflection or qualification, it's clear that in that context, at least, we haven't really come to grips with what he found. After Finis, though, we're without excuse. We now know that a relatively high percentage of patients lumped into this vegetative state category respond well to therapeutic interventions. Very, very high percentage, or reasonably high percentage if they actually get the therapeutic interventions. But as Finis notes, and he is by no means a conservative or pro-lifer or Christian at all, he says the vegetative state has become something of a catechism in North American bioethics. I think that's a very interesting word to describe it. And he speaks dramatically and movingly about the need to think of the battle for this population as being one for basic civil rights. And again, if you know anything about Joe Finis, this is just an astonishing move on his part. Why hasn't his call for civil rights, a new civil rights movement, been heeded? Finis says, despite the stunning evidence to the contrary, the clinical response to patients in so-called PVS has been prognostic pessimism, therapeutic nihilism, and he gives two reasons for this. First, the commitment of healthcare resources is considered by many just to be too large, which I think is actually related to judgments about equality and quality of life as well. Again, the connection of resources. And two, the rejection of the perceived fixity of so-called a permanent vegetative state or persistent vegetative state could, quote, undermine the hard-won right to die, end quote, including the iconic case of Terry Schiavo. Indeed, Finis asks provocatively, without the futility of the permanent vegetative state, of permanent unconsciousness, are we obliged to promote a culture of life? And a few times he actually links this with the fight over abortion rights as well, which I think is a very salient point as well, and it's the point I'll turn to next. Many of us, especially after sessions at this wonderful conference, are thinking a lot about Dobbs and a lot about Casey, right? The decision that replaced Roe versus Wade. The plurality opinion from O'Connor, Souter, written, I think there are people in this room that could maybe correct me on this, but I think from mostly O'Connor, Souter, and Kennedy, replaced the privacy-centered standard in Roe with a different model. And with remarkable candor, in one very important section, they invoke economic interests as a center of their decision. This is from the Casey decision. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized their intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives, end quote. So the marginalization of prenatal children continues in Casey, not necessarily because of privacy questions, but about questions about economics and just allocation of resources. Again, those of you who are from this area, you probably know the infamous abortion doctor, Erlich Klofner. He made national news back in 2019 for keeping thousands of prenatal body parts in his garage and even in the trunk of his car. Local media, which covered the story, started digging around into his broader dealings, and that included an interview from CBS Chicago with a woman whose name they kept private, who was treated, I put that word in quotes, by Dr. Klofner. The woman, when she heard about this story, said, I thought to myself, oh God, I did this awful thing, and my children are possibly held in a box somewhere in a house. I cried. She mentions children because he aborted 2 of her children. They were twins. I said to myself, I can't bring my kids into this situation. I can't bring my kids into poverty. I can't bring my kids to a father who won't love them or want them. And yet she was still waffling. She still wasn't sure about this. Dr. Klofner wanted her to make herself sure about this, and his response was, this is according to her again, he said, if you don't do this, it will cost you yearly $240,000 to take care of a kid. So would you rather deal with that? Would you rather go home and just go back to your regular life? There was no emotion. There was no empathy. So let me kind of summarize where I hope I've been taking us for the last few minutes. I want to argue that there's a confluence of several interrelated factors that have put us on our current trajectory. The first is the secularization of medicine and the rise and dominance of irreligious bioethics. The second is the Copernican revolution that Singer talks about against fundamental human equality. Third is pressure on medical and other kinds of resources. And four, interlocking and mutually reinforcing independent views about moral status in relation to brain death, vegetative state, abortion, and more. But let's think about where we might be headed next, not just where we've been, but where are we going? One of the things that the pandemic revealed, the pandemic revealed lots of things, but one of the most important things, especially for what I want to argue about what's next, is that it revealed the horrific ways in which we treat our elderly, especially those who have advanced dementia. The story from Politico at the top there is a really important one, an investigation done by Politico, in which they reveal that there's tons and thousands, in fact, of people with dementia who died not of COVID, but of something else, most likely just being abandoned. And AP also got in on the action, talking about those kinds of deaths, probably due to some kind of negligence as well. And the connection here that's interesting to me is that an interviewee actually in Rights Come to Mind, Joe Finn's book again, mentioned that there was an author, there was a parent actually, who mentioned a nursing home floor in which, quote, they just put everybody who had no opportunity or no prospect of ever being very alive, Alzheimer's patients, people who were in PVS. So they had this horrible second floor. If you went up there, it was filthy, the staff was bad. So it's interesting, this person invoking this floor makes an explicit connection between how, to use throwaway culture as a way of thinking about it, we just kind of threw away people with PVS or with Alzheimer's because that's where we just throw them. And I want to invoke the story of Cora Singer as well. Cora Singer is the mother of Peter Singer. And I was just talking about this with him last week. He invites me to debate him on the moral status of the fetus in front of his 200 or 300 Princeton undergraduates. We have a good time doing this. And I have a good time talking to the Princeton undergraduates who've really not heard any of these arguments before, interestingly enough. But we were just talking about this in his office before his class the other day, and he mentioned that it was the case that both his mom and himself decided that if she had ever got to this point with dementia and she developed advanced dementia, that she would no longer count as a person and that he should not put resources into her care. That's interesting because Peter Singer, in fact, did use his own resources to care for her. And some of my students, when we go over this in class, say, well, he's just a hypocrite. He's just a hypocrite. How can anybody believe this? But I'm careful to mention that if the standard for an ethics being true is our ability to live it out, we Christians are in pretty serious trouble too. So let's not use that standard for that. But when I talked to him about it, he's like, it's just that I was too weak to live out what I thought was true. He doesn't think the ethic is mistaken. He just thought he was too weak to live it out. He really still believes that his mother was not a person at that stage of her life. So at the risk of playing music that is way too melodramatic, I want you to play 2 minutes from my book trailer, because I think in light of what we're setting up to find now with later stage dementia, we have a crisis on our hands, and that's why I'm sounding the alarm here. So again, I apologize for the melodramatic music. It wasn't my choice.
I know, it's the last thing you want to think about. But consider the COVID-19 pandemic with me for a moment. I'd invite you to think not about the virus, but about what it has exposed. There's something going on and it needs to be sorted out. That's a quote from Robert Anderson, Chief of Mortality Statistics at the CDC. Our unspoken horror story in this country is how we treat people in nursing homes, especially those suffering from dementia. Worldwide, more than 50 million people are living with dementia. And that number will double every 20 years. Nurses are abandoning the profession, leaving nursing homes understaffed. People can make better money at Walmart than they can by caring for our most vulnerable. This is on track to get worse and spiral into a crisis that touches everyone and damages everything. Society can therefore choose one of three paths. First, we can slouch towards robot care, which isn't real care because it isn't human. Second, we could slide into euthanasia, solving a social problem by killing those who need care. The third option is to move with urgency to restore human dignity. A challenging path, but one with clear social and moral benefits and one with a strong pre-existing foundation.
If you think that's too dramatic, and with that kind of music you might suspect it is, I want to just go to a few news stories which might suggest that's not too dramatic. We're already seeing activists explicitly say they want to force caregivers to starve dementia patients to death. Canada recently legalized assisted suicide explicitly for disabled people. And by the way, California also now has a push to include people with dementia as being available for their assisted suicide. We're not going to slide down a slippery slope, right, guys? It's not going to happen. We got the safeguards in place. And then an astonishing article written in the Hastings Center report, which is one of the best journals, academic journals in all of bioethics, arguing that we should start thinking about advanced directive implants to kill people with dementia over time. It was there. It was in the Hastings Center report. And again, let's focus more on the less extreme side, because you could say, well, those are kind of nut-picking, that's a nut-picking fallacy or something. The New York Times recently did a really important expose on what's actually going on in nursing homes with dementia patients. And they found physicians working for nursing homes regularly write scripts for antipsychotic drugs for residents who don't need them. Schizophrenia diagnoses are up dramatically while delusions and hallucinations are actually down. A federal agency found that 1/3 of long-term nursing home patients diagnosed with schizophrenia had no record of ever being treated for the condition. And what's really going on here is they want docile. They want, in part because of resource and staffing issues, let's be clear and honest about that, but they want docile, but these drugs actually double the chances of them dying. So let's do the ethical math on that one. How to respond? Well, again, my main goal is simply to raise the alarm about this, because I frankly don't hear a lot of discussion about late-stage dementia as needing the kind of urgency that it requires. We need to have absolute, very clear urgency with regard to this. And in responding, we should have no shame or embarrassment for having a theological point of view. That theological point of view is absolutely necessary in responding to this crisis. There's no need to hide it or translate it away. And I'd add, I think, and maybe in question and answer and in engaging with Jerry, we can talk about this. I think it's the case that dementia has not yet been politicized the way the other kinds of issues have been politicized. So could it actually serve as an important bridge for dialogue here, right? I think especially about our very important relationships with disability rights communities and others who could be strong allies here. And it wouldn't be shoved into this red-blue antagonistic binary as so much of the culture wants to shove these issues we've been talking about the last few days. My book argues that for three actually kind of steps, a short-term, medium-term, and long-term approach to how to respond. And here's another place that I think dialogue can be really important. I'm glad we're going to have some time to talk about this, because I hope we get a chance to talk about maybe some creative responses. Short term, I think all of us personally, or many of us personally, can make decisions pretty close to now, actually, about how to think about what to do. Can we choose to live closer to home? Can we choose to have bigger families? Can we make housing decisions with the elderly and those with who are likely, or I think about 1/3 of us are going to end up with dementia, if the numbers are correct. Those who are likely to end up with dementia. Can we make housing decisions in light of that? I even recently heard a friend of mine at dinner 2 nights ago suggest that maybe how you will take care of your parents is part of marriage, should be part of marriage prep in the Catholic Church. I think that would be a really interesting kind of intervention. Churches should be doing creative things like this more broadly, I think, including using our physical plants in different ways. Tragically, we have a lot of empty schools, rectories, convents, but we can repurpose those buildings, can't we, in various ways that could address some of what's going on here. I actually asked my local pastor at my local church where we attend in West Orange, New Jersey about this, because we're about to have a very empty convent. I think we have one or two sisters, retired sisters, living in there. And we have our school, which we're essentially leasing out to another group to educate at-risk children. And I just thought, and maybe this is an ivory tower professor's dream or something, but I just thought, well, why can't we have a kind of intergenerational thing going on our parish campus, essentially, right? Why can't we turn the convent into a care home for the disabled and those suffering from dementia that would have a genuine culture of encounter that would include, in part, engagement with the students that are on our campus there too. And it's actually so perfect. There's actually a garden right in the middle between the two buildings. I just think about, older people and younger people kind of, mixing and matching and talking and learning in that context in a way that would be so, so good for both of them. I mean, let's face it, the two most lonely populations today, and all of us are more lonely than we used to be, I think, are young people and older people, right? And we can really work, I think, to create this. The church can be a really important place to create those structures. And then public policy, I think, is super important. Well, this is all shorter term stuff. So one of the several wonderful things with Build Back Better, it seems to me, is a revamping of our elder care system, including funding from Medicaid and Medicare for reimbursement for in-home care. I think we got to be focused in particular on reimbursing and allowing families to take care of their loved ones at home. And actually, it's much, much cheaper for those of you who are fiscal conservatives. It's much, much cheaper, actually, just to pay for the care at home than it is for the care in the nursing home. So there's more to say about that, and I wrote a book on it. If you want to know more, we can talk. But let me move to medium term. So medium term is what I call for is basically trying to build dialogue. And I already mentioned, and build allies through dialogue on this. And I already mentioned disability rights groups. And maybe we could talk more about that. Other religious groups, especially the fellow people of the book, right, who share this moral anthropology, I think would be really important to ally with in trying to restore dignity, right? But what if we fail? That's the third level. Arbitrarily or somewhat arbitrarily, I say, let's try for a decade or so and see what we can do. But if we fail to reverse course as a culture, I think the church is really going to have to step up in a very, very dramatic way, perhaps, again, allied with other religious communities that share our moral anthropology, and really have a massive all-hands-on-deck approach here. Again, this population will double in 20 years. It's going to triple. I just learned this the other day. It's going to triple in 30 years. And we already are way, way, way beyond our ability to care for the patients we already have. In the book, I go through all sorts of things. I think we'll need brand new religious orders, the retooling of current religious orders, hundreds of new hospitals and clinics, along with thousands of nursing homes that'll need to be built and maintained. And if the surrounding culture is hostile to our understanding of fundamental human dignity, which is likely the case if it doesn't work over the next decade or so, we need to be prepared, as we have in the past, to build institutions that will resist those practices as well and protect religious freedom along those lines. And these institutions, this is really important, especially given the lack of resources and nurses quitting the profession. We need, consistent with Catholic social doctrine, to pay a living wage to these employees too. It's absolutely pathetic what we currently pay folks to take care of our elderly loved ones. So hopefully it does not come to that. But if it does, we need to be ready, and maybe we need to start planning now so we can be ready. But let me just go back to what we can do right now. And this is what I want to finish with. There's so much as individuals we can do, even in just kind of basic relationships with our families in this regard. And it's in that spirit I want to finish with some sacred scripture. This is Sirach 3:12-15. My son, be steadfast in honoring your father. Do not grieve him as long as he lives. Even if his mind fails, be considerate of him. Do not revile him because you are in your prime. Kindness to a father will not be forgotten. It will serve as a sin offering. It will take lasting root. In a time of trouble, it will be recalled to your advantage. Like warmth upon frost, it will melt away your sins. Thank you.
I want to start out by thanking Carter Sneed for inviting me to give a response to Charlie's talk. It's really a privilege to be responding to Charlie. I don't think I've ever been in this position since I was responding to his papers in doctoral seminars. But I just want to start with two little anecdotes that show a lot about the good that Charlie is doing. One is that in 2016-17, I had occasion to be in Princeton at the Center for Theological Inquiry for a year. And Peter Singer invited Charlie and a couple other people to be on a panel. And I was just so happy to have Charlie in that situation. But it was just remarkable how many Princeton University students and faculty members afterwards, when they found out I knew, students right at the reception afterwards and faculty members over the course of the year who found out I knew Charlie, how impressed they were with this wasn't his first, but with his many engagements at Princeton University. And I can tell you that's a hard crowd there to be doing the kinds of things Charlie does with them. So it was really impressive that they had this reaction. And I actually got some cred from knowing Charlie Camozzi, which I'm always happy about too.
Glad it went the other way once.
Then the other, I have occasion often to teach Charlie's work in my undergraduate bioethics course. And again, this is a little bit maybe cheesy, but I have them, after they read it, and of course they always like what he says and are really engaged with it, I tell them he was the first teaching assistant that I had for this bioethics course that they are now in. And they always love the fact that they have a kind of historical continuity with Charlie Camozzi. So first, to start my formal remarks, I want to thank Charlie for a splendid presentation. No bioethicist today is better at stating exactly what is at stake morally in these developments and what they portend for all who are committed to upholding human dignity. I'm not going to thank Charlie for saying so much that I agree with, because it actually made it very hard for me to do this response. I'm in agreement with just about everything he said. So I'm going to attempt to work around the edges of his talk and raise some questions that I hope will be worthwhile. So Charlie's thesis is indisputable. More and more human beings are being excluded from the protections that follow from the dignity of human beings. The case of Jahai McMath and the misuse of the determinations of brain death, the case of Terry Schiavo, the misuse of diagnosis of permanent vegetative states, the economic argument for abortion rights, the treatment of people with dementia. These developments all indicate a seemingly irreversible exclusion of vulnerable human beings from the protection of human life that is implied in the principle of human dignity. I agree with this thesis, but I'll raise three questions about what Charlie does with it. And these are really going to have to do with the cases of brain death and persistent vegetative state. First, with respect to the determination of brain death and persistent vegetative states, a critic, that's not me, but a critic, might suggest that it is too early in the trajectory that begins with discovery and ends in policy to say with confidence whether resistance to emerging evidence of brain activity and consciousness is due to eroding respect for life or simply due to the way biomedical research typically proceeds. Biomedicine, the critic might say, is like science, as Thomas Kuhn described it. New discoveries often face resistance until they accumulate to the point where they can no longer be dismissed. If cases similar to the McMath case continue to generate evidence of responsive unawake syndrome, and if Finis' research suggesting that many people who have been diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state are in fact in a minimally conscious state, if that research is increasingly replicated, then at some point, the accumulated evidence should overcome the resistance. If the resistance remains after that point, then we may conclude that an unwillingness to keep people in impaired conditions alive is at play. My question is, can Professor Camozzi assure such a critic that we are now at the point where we know whether it is one or the other? Second, for Charlie, the blame for our situation runs deep. In the McMath case, he implicates not only the abuse of methods of determining brain death, but the brain definition of death itself, pointing out the nefarious motives that accompanied its initial adoption. In the Shivo case, he suggests that the very notion of the persistent vegetative state is at fault. The implication, as I understand it, is that both brain death and PVS have been widely accepted, not because of the objective biomedical evidence in their favor, but because of an interest in not keeping people in certain conditions alive, whether because their bodies are more useful when dead, or because their lives are costly or deemed not worth living. But of course, people who respect life have, even until now, accepted both brain death and PVS in good faith. And my suspicion is that if we replace brain death with something else and persistent vegetative state with minimally conscious state, people who do not respect life will still have grounds for ending the lives of people in such states. So my question is this: if the interests in not keeping certain people alive are as determinative as Charlie suggests, how much confidence should we put in replacements for brain death or PVS? To recognize that some people we thought were dead are alive, and some people we thought were not conscious are conscious, is of course a great gain, but only if we respect their lives in responsive, unawake, or minimally conscious states. As long as people are convinced that lives in those states are inconvenient or not worth living, won't the future Jerai McMaths and Terry Shivos be just as vulnerable as they are now? In short, these changes should be welcomed for many reasons, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient conditions for increasing respect for life. Third, Charlie suggests at several points that only a religious ethic can count for the equality of all members of the human family. I agree that a religious ethic is best suited to this task. In fact, I would say that the affirmation that human beings bear the image of God, that each human being bears the image of God and shares in God's own inviolability by virtue of being in God's image, seems to me to be the most secure basis for the equal protection of all human lives. I also agree with Charlie that Christians and people of other faiths that have similar or analogous ways of grounding human equality should not hesitate to speak in the voice of their religious tradition. At the same time, I wonder whether Christians, precisely as Christians, also have a stake in articulating secular grounds for human equality. For example, many secular people attach moral status to rational agency. Christians influenced by Aquinas might recall that Aquinas identified the image of God with rational agency. Surely it would be worthwhile for such Christians to try to persuade their secular interlocutors that to enjoy moral status, one need not be capable of exercising rational agency, but need only have the basic biological conditions for it, or be a member of a species that has rational agency as an essential characteristic. That argument may not succeed in persuading anyone, but it implies that the principle of human equality is grounded in our nature as created by God and is intelligible apart from special revelation. And that is something Christians affirm precisely when they are speaking in their own voice. In conclusion, I want to thank Charlie again for a terrific presentation, and I look forward to hearing now what others have to say about it. Thank you.
Well, Well, thanks to our speakers for leaving us ample time for discussion. We've got a good half hour left here. So there's a microphone over here. If people want to come up, please feel free. And we'll just have everybody seated, right? And address people from here.
Hi, Charlie. Michael Waddell from St. Mary's College. I want to pick up a thread that I think Jerry was developing there at the very end. A couple of times through your talk, I'm just sort of take some things out of context, but just to sort of point toward what I'm interested in. So at one point you said the theological point of view is absolutely necessary in responding to the crisis. And a bit earlier on, you said once we did away with the theological concept of human nature being made in the image and likeness of God, there was nothing left but capacities, right? And then you said that some humans appear not to have these capacities at all. So I would agree with you that the theological perspective is helpful and, more importantly, true. But I also think that there is a secular or philosophical position that could be worked out here. Jerry talks about the material conditions. I think we could talk about it in terms of human nature or even capacities of the soul. And I think that we're doing ourselves and others a disservice by just sort of shooting right past this. In what I've read of Peter Singer's work, he seems always to say that the idea that every human being has a kind of inherent dignity is simply a religious idea and has no place in a secular or pluralistic society. And so I think when we concede that ground to him, that there's no sort of rational, that is to say, natural reason position that could be staked out without recourse to revelation or tenets of faith to defend human dignity. I think that we play to his hand. Now, again, it may be that we'll lose those arguments, but I think the arguments at least need to be formulated and tested. And so maybe just to sort of finish with one sort of quick terminological note, I think Jerry was mentioning this as well, but if we think that there might be a certain dignity present in the human soul, in the power of rationality or human nature, then we should perhaps not say things like there are human beings who appear not to have these capacities, but rather that they might not be able to act on those capacities or use them, right? The capacities could still be there. They just can't operationalize them because something's wrong perhaps with the material apparatus or something like that. So I'll stop there, but I wanted to ask you about those things.
Yeah, thank you. With regard to the last point, I've written a ton on actualized capacities and potential due to nature and kind and making those distinctions. So I totally agree with that. I meant to say actualized capacities if I didn't say it. I meant to say it. But with regard to the broader point that both of you are making here, I wonder if a little history of bioethics is in order just to maybe shed some light on the question. I used Dan Callahan's great memoir on bioethics, In Search of the Good, is that the title of it? To draw a kind of to use historical analysis to think about how this has worked, essentially. So, as many of you know, moral theologians were the first bioethicists. We kind of invented the discipline. That's no longer the case, obviously, or at least we don't have the same place we did. But there was this intermediate stage where really important, very eminent moral theologians still were very much part of the field in a very profound way. I'm thinking here particularly of people like Paul Ramsey and Richard McCormick. But even though they identified as moral theologians, they really tried their best to do what I take you and Jerry to be trying to point to. And it didn't go so well. As both of you, I guess, did admit or highlight, or at least provide a place for it happening, it didn't really work. People were not convinced by their arguments. And now, and this is a big central part of the first part of my book, actually, theologians really aren't welcome to speak in many, many places. This is one of the few conferences that takes bioethics seriously, that welcomes thick theological ways of making arguments. I just submitted, against my better judgment, an article to the American Journal of Bioethics. I'm sure it's going to be rejected because I'm invoking, maybe it's bad too, but I'm sure it'll be rejected because it has some thick theological principles in it. So again, that doesn't really get to the specifics of what you're talking about. I think it'd be interesting to talk about what Aquinas meant by rationality, and if it's the same, if it's the kind of thing that we mean by rationality today, and that sort of thing. But that gets us into deep waters pretty quickly. But I think it's worth noting that the trajectory in which we found ourselves when we translated our thick theology into something else with precisely these laudable goals in mind. And by the way, I'm a philosophy major. I went to a year of graduate school in philosophy. I originally wanted to go down this path too. And even in my time at Notre Dame and my early part at Fordham, I really believe more strongly in this. But over time and learning this history more, I've just become less positive about a good outcome here.
My name is Landon Kent, and I'm currently a student at Benedictine College in Kansas, and I'm currently a pre-med student as well, and I have a question for Professor Camosi. So all of us here today we're learning about ethics and medicine, but my question is, like, for me personally, I'm taking a lot of classes that are purely concerned with the biological and psychological needs of patients, and if it wasn't for classes outside of that, I wouldn't have seen the theological or philosophical aspects of what it means to be human. So my question is, do you think that there's a current lack of preparing healthcare providers in the medical field to see people as they are outside of just purely biological and psychological? And if so, is this a contribution to the problem that we're facing, and how can we fix it?
Boy, have I got a panel for you. It just happened before lunch. I'm sorry that you weren't able to go because it was so good and it was just right on this question. And Dr. Collier, who's in the front row here, was a major part of that panel, and she gave. You should really ask her for her paper on this. So yes, the answer is yes. It's a major problem, and it's a foundational problem. And those people on the panel really articulate it better than I will here. But really, we need new structures, we need new understandings, we need new institutions to do this. I don't know. Does Notre Dame have a medical school? Does anybody know? If not, they should, where you can kind of build it from the ground up with precisely the kinds of concerns that you have in mind. That doesn't disconnect the technocratic, carpentry and plumbing from broader visions of the good and of the human person. And so in some ways, it's really, not in some ways, it's just totally unfortunate that you had the experience you had, but it's not a unique experience. I'm sure you're aware. And so, it's a shame that people like you are going to be forced, you get to come to conferences like this, but are forced to come to conferences like this, read on your own. It really should be part of the formal structure of the program you're in.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good afternoon. I'm Lucia Luzondo. I'm the Director of Hispanic Outreach at the Person and Identity Project at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, and we deal with gender ideology. My question to you is not regarding within the medical topic you're talking about, but I would love to know your thoughts about the so-called gender affirming care, where people are essentially self-diagnosed. They get hormones, cross-sex hormones on the first visit, and they get put on a medical path of medicalization that makes them a patient for a lifetime, in my view, without any type of testing or data or evaluation whatsoever. That can end up with the amputation, permanent amputation of perfectly healthy body parts, in my view, completely contrary to the Hippocratic Oath of never do harm, and where many of these decisions are made in infancy, when the human brain is not fully developed until plus or minus 25 years. And we have children as early as 8, girls at 18 removing breasts and double mastectomies, and young people before they reach the maturity and because of a self-perception. They call that today gender dysphoria. Many cases, I believe, are a social contagion. and in my view is a tragedy. What is your point of view on this gender affirming care and this, quote, transgender medicine, if you can call it medicine, and this doing of these processes of transitions that could never change a man into a woman or a woman into a man because it's biologically impossible? Thank you.
Thank you. We said quite a bit, and thank you for your question. I recently got asked to review a manuscript from a major publisher regarding a lot of the issues that you just mentioned. I don't know if this is too weak sauce, but I decided I couldn't review it because I didn't know enough about these things, what you just described. I haven't researched it. I will say, just a layman's view, two things. First, it sounds to me like we might be in a similar situation or analogous situation to what we were with brain death and PVS, where we kind of rushed ahead. You know, there was this push and it was connected to ideology, but not totally connected to ideology. You know, there was good science being done, or at least attempted. And we pushed ahead so fast without even really thinking about where we were headed or what the implications of what we were doing was. And again, I'm not an expert, but it sounds like maybe something similar is going on here. We're kind of rushing ahead. We're not really thinking long-term. And maybe even, is it fair to say the market is playing a role here? There's significant money to be made. So again, I'm not an expert. So
$500,000 in the lifetime of the patient, and a patient for life.
Yeah. So yeah, that's where I would leave that.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Richard Mitchell. I'm an attorney in California, and I had two questions, if I may. First one has to do with the right to deny extraordinary care and how that might fit in with this conversation, because obviously a certain number of people don't have directives sufficient that would be completely in accord with Catholic teaching, and yet doctors are left with someone because they didn't give a directive. The doctors must continue care basically on infinitum. I wonder if you could comment on that. And the other thing is, I find it wonderful that you're able to be around, obviously you're very impassioned and knowledgeable about your subject, and how you can be around someone like Peter Singer and it be comfortable. Thank you.
Well, I remember the first time I met him, he said, because I was writing my book for Cambridge on Peter Singer and Christian ethics, and I knew he was writing another book at the time. I wanted to get his latest version, so I emailed him thinking that he wouldn't respond, but then he did respond. He's like, let's go get vegan food in the city. I live in New York, and I was pretty nervous for that. But now frankly, and this is something we talked about last week too, he's one of the few, especially in the context that he's in at Princeton, who's really willing to do straight up no chaser like arguments and evidence and really go at it on the basis of that methodology. And there's really not, from my perspective, I know this maybe sounds strange, there's really not an ideological bone in his body from my perspective. In fact, just to give you an example of this, we helped, we were co-organizers for a conference at Princeton in 2010, trying to find new ways to think and speak about abortion. And John Finis went at him really hard in the opening session, saying, we shouldn't use this term fetus. It's like the new F word. Nobody uses the term fetus in other conversations, like nobody ever heard of a fetus bump or something like that, right? It's a baby bump. Nobody's with fetus, right? They're with child. But he was willing to say, as a result of that, now even in our debate, he says child and he says baby. And so again, he hasn't changed his fundamental position, but he's really willing to engage. So that's one thing I really appreciate about him. And he's really a strong defender. And he was also one of the founding editors of something called the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which is an attempt to protect people who want to make controversial arguments under pseudonyms if necessary, especially in our current so-called cancel culture moment where it's sometimes difficult to be heard on those questions. And they're accepting, in fact, we were on a Zoom call for the first annual meeting of the Society of Christian Bioethicists. And he told that group, we had an exchange as part of one of the plenary sessions, and he told that group, submit proposals, right? We want to hear from you, Christian bioethicists, for the Journal of Controversial Ideas. But back to your first question, as a Catholic moral theologian, I am totally on board and enthusiastic about the distinction between obviously ordinary and extraordinary means proportionate treatment. It does get pretty dicey though, doesn't it? When the definition for euthanasia, the Catholic definition of euthanasia is an act or an omission which by itself or by intention causes death, which of itself or by intention causes death. And there's plenty, it seems to me, of aiming at death by omission that isn't removal of extraordinary treatment. And that's so if we can make those distinctions, and often I think we need to be really careful about making those distinctions, because what's often really going on, it seems to me, is a kind of baby doe judgment about not choosing to treat someone because of their quality of life, which is actually aiming at death. And it gets parsed out as refusing extraordinary treatment. And so if it is, in fact, removal of extraordinary treatment, foreseeing but not intending that death is going to be the result, then we should be clear about that. But if it's aiming at death by omission, we should also be clear about that too.
My name is Xavier Simmons. I'm from the Australian Catholic University. I just had a question about responding to criterial definitions of personhood that seem to have a lot of get a lot of traction in philosophy and just in general. So by criterial definitions of personhood, I mean defining a person in terms of some specific criterion or set of criteria like consciousness or self-reflection or whatever, use of free will, use of language. So now I think you're proposing kind of that we need to bring theological concepts into the picture and have a theological concept of the person and human dignity, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I think, one issue with that, particularly with the idea of building dialogue with disability rights groups, is I think in the disability rights like literature and disability scholars, they don't tend to like theologians too much. I actually heard a disability rights scholar say this the other day. And I suppose there's this challenge like that you want to build dialogue, but at the same time, like bring theology in, which tends to kind of preclude dialogue. So I'm just wondering how to navigate that in the context of these sort of big debates about personhood. Thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if it's theology that is the impediment rather than a kind of political ideology that's the impediment. Because I think, and I was talking with Lisa, who gave the plenary on this. I don't know if you're talking about her plenary talk about this, but I was talking with her at dinner on Thursday about this, and I said, well, yeah, maybe that's true about abortion. But when it comes to assisted suicide, again, some of our most important dialogue partners and frankly partners in trying to defeat these measures, both in the UK and in the United States and a few other places around the world, are in fact disability rights groups who, again, many don't share, some do, our theological presuppositions. And so I wonder if it's really abortion that is doing the work there rather than theology, and there than the problem with a specific theological point of view. Because when the USCCB or the New York State Catholic Conference or California State Catholic Conference tries to work with disability rights groups on euthanasia, there's never a sense that, at least as far as I know, maybe with some groups, but there's very rarely a sense that we can't work with you because you're explicitly theological in your perspective. I'd also add that this kind of dialogue, when it comes to get more resources for the disabled, making like the disability rights, civil rights movement was really another example of this kind of cooperation with both, explicitly theological folks and other folks working. So again, I wonder, and I just wonder if it's really the politics of abortion or the politics of other issues that is the real wrench, as opposed to, hey, you guys are using theology, we can't work with you.
Hi, I'm Janine Birchie-Johnson. I'm Director of Campus Ministries at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart. I really thank you for your emphasis on dementia and what's happening there. That was really very helpful to see that outlined. One of the things, when you talked about what the church can do, I think we can name the reality of dementia in our midst. A few years ago, I preached a sermon at my home congregation on dementia, and then it was published by our denominational magazine, The Mennonite, in 2018. And in that sermon, I talked about the role of memory in the scriptures, and then pointed out that we often think of the ability to remember and articulate faith as being at the center. And I said, no, it's not that we remember God, but that God remembers us. And outlined that in the scriptures, both in the songs of Mary and Zechariah, and in 30 places in the Old Testament, there are these calls for God to remember us, or statements that God does remember us. And then I outlined ways the congregation can help support people with dementia and their families. And I was just struck by how many people responded to that afterwards. I had no idea how many people felt alone in this journey. My mom was diagnosed just a few years before I did the sermon. So this has been something I think the church needs to just name it and talk about it and offer these kind of practical faith suggestions for how we live into this reality. What do you?
Thank you. That's well said.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Stan Franzek from Chicago, and just recently I retired from my neurosurgical practice after 47 years. Overall, I probably pronounced brain death on anywhere from 400 to 500 people. Usually I'd average one a month over that period of time. With regards to what you said about brain death with Ms. Shivo, she was not brain dead.
I didn't say that she was.
Okay, but the point is I think the world record for recovering from a PVS is 20 years. And I personally have had 4 patients recover. Granted, they're severely disabled, but I've seen 4 patients recover consciousness after 4 years. With regard to the diagnosis of brain death, it's very easy. As long as you can fulfill clinically all of the criteria, they're brain dead. Jahai, we were at Harvard, and I discussed the case with Alan Schumann, who talks about periods and healing wounds and all that. As far as we're concerned, brain death means the person is gone. The body can continue to function, but the person, the brain, the person that was your mother, your father, they're essentially gone. And as I said, for Jahai, that was a misdiagnosis. There were, she had a posterior fossa hemorrhage. We looked at the MRIs and things. You don't make the diagnosis of brain death under those circumstances. So she was misdiagnosed. And I don't think in our neurosurgical literature, we have never found anybody wake up if they fulfilled all the classic criteria. So.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I think you illustrated in part what's at stake in a disagreement about moral anthropology here, right? So if you have a very different understanding of what a human person is, and it sounds like you and I do, right? I firmly believe that someone who is gestating a child whose body reacts to being cut with releasing of hormones that can fight off infections, that can get their first period. Well, I guess we might say with her, maybe it was a mixed diagnosis, but let's stick with the other ones. That is somebody who is shares our fundamental nature as a human being. So you and I, it sounds like, have a disagreement about moral anthropology, which would lead to the kind of disagreement that you just articulated.
Well, we associate brain death with brain failure, much as you would say kidney failure. That organ is not working anymore.
Right, I know that.
And that organ is the seat of your consciousness and being and your, well, not necessarily being qua being a person, but you basically have lost it as a functioning human being. And as I said, the literature shows you never come back from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you helpfully articulated where we have our disagreement here, because, of course, I'm going to deny that the brain is the center of who we are in precisely the way you just described. In fact, I'm going to argue that before we had a brain, we were the same human animal that we are now. I'd argue that after our brain is really catastrophically damaged, we remain, if we are, in fact, still alive in the ways I just described, the same kind of human animal that we are now. And I think it's interesting you use the word consciousness, because it seems like, and I need to do more study of this, but from my the study I've done on this, it seems like the literature is that we can't locate consciousness in the brain, that we've tried for many decades now to locate consciousness in the brain. In fact, there are philosophers of mine, you probably know, like Dan Dennett and others, who say consciousness is an illusion because it must be in the brain, and since it's not in the brain, it must be an illusion, which I think is so fascinating. But yeah, so I guess thank you for helping to articulate a really important disagreement.
You bet. Thank you.
Dan Burns, University of Dallas. I have a question for either of you. I'm just wondering, taking for granted everything that both of you were saying in your talks, whether there's any room left for the concept of dying with dignity, precisely for those who reject euthanasia. It seems to me that there are a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, who would like at some point to be able to say, I'd like to, refuse extraordinary means on my own terms, die in some way that's not overly medical, that doesn't separate me from my family, that allows me to say my goodbyes and to be as conscious as possible during it. And it's not obvious to me, did that just cut out? It's not obvious to me that you are rejecting that, but you also didn't say anything about it. And I'm just wondering what if any, place there is for that kind of idea in everything that you have been saying.
I think there's a very strong place, an incredibly strong place. That's one reason why there is such a robust, and I agree with the robust teaching of the church on the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means, and how precisely the kinds of concerns you raise are so important for thinking about that. But again, I just want to make, especially in light of what I just presented, I want to be hyper aware and I want to be hyper concerned about what is actually being aimed at in the removal or foregoing of treatment. So if it is along the lines you just suggested, if I understood you correctly, I think that would certainly pass muster. But if it's a different kind of thing, which is basically saying, my life is too burdensome on somebody else, my life is not productive, by the standards that we've mentioned earlier, it doesn't count the same. Then it sounds like what we're doing is aiming at death by omission, right? And not refusing extraordinary treatment.
My name is Steve O'Neill, and I'm a general surgeon in Indianapolis. I read your book in the last week and really enjoyed it. I was looking for hope in it, and I know you tried to give hope in your short-term, intermediate, and long-term plans, but I am not seeing the hope within the profession. And what prompted me to come up and ask this question is this young man here from Benedictine who is 35 years behind where I was, and the profession has shifted during that time from what I've been seeing with regards to healthcare professionals' attitudes in the hospital, in the clinics, towards individuals and the value of life. We look at the statistics for physicians who are pro the choice of abortion, those that are pro euthanasia, and other things with regards to their perception of the value of individual human lives. So when we talk about, we have to have educational programs for physicians and that sort of thing, I see it moving away from that currently rather than towards that. I was just talking earlier to the executive director of Canadian Physicians for Life, and Canada is much further down that road where they're even screening potential med students out if they have overt pro-life views. So
it's happening here,
unfortunately,
by the way,
yes, it is. And people are, even physicians in the profession who feel strongly in a manner to go against the tide are self-censoring, are being quiet because of this push in that direction. So I think this is a much larger problem that we have going on. And it's going to be very difficult to reverse.
Can we do the two questions together? Is that okay? So everybody gets a chance. I want to make sure you get it and respond to it. Is that okay?
Richard Dorflinger, a fellow with the Center for Ethics and Culture. I wasn't going to ask a question, but I was provoked by the discussion just now of brain death. I mean, I think it's important for people to realize there are at least two and maybe more meanings of brain death or brain-oriented criteria for determining death, because there's very faithful Catholic physicians, ethicists, and so on, who would agree with the definition that's in the Uniform Determination of Death Act that says you're talking about the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. It's brain stem because it's the center of the brain that's usually associated with the organizing of involuntary reflexes around the body. And so their idea is from not a quality of life perspective, but from just an idea of the brain as the place that helps to organize this set of organs and organ systems that we are into a functioning whole physiologically. When that is gone, life cannot be maintained. We used to say irreversible loss of cardiac function or lung function, but then we realized we could resuscitate people unless that was gone long enough to damage the brain, to destroy the brain, to deprive it of oxygen. So I think that is, it may be right or it may be wrong in terms of its criteria, but I don't think it's an invidious quality of life judgment. Talking about a division between the person and the body is something else altogether, in my view. But I just wanted to see if you react to that.
Thank you, Rich. I'll start with yours, and then I'll go to the first one. So I think that's well said. And I don't think my judgment was as broad as that. There are, of course, lots of good Catholics and good pro-lifers who have the view that you just articulated. I would say, though, I think it's, and there's probably people in this room that can speak to this, but more than I can. It does seem that a lot of the work that's being done after a catastrophic brain injury is being done by the spinal cord and not the brain stem. So the spinal cord can actually take over for a lot of those things. That's at least my understanding. We probably don't have time to get into it. With regard to the options that are available to us and hope, there were two people that you were standing next to when you asked that question, Jeff Bishop on your left and Kristen Collier on your right, who are leading voices in offering the kinds of alternatives that we're talking about here. And also, I've recently become aware of the good work that Creighton Medical School is doing, both in Omaha and in Phoenix, to form medical students in a very different kind of way. So those are the things that give me hope. And these three institutions are not the only ones, but there are seeds being planted. There are people working on this. And this conference is a really important gathering place for those folks to really address the kind of problems that you mentioned.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you.